Uh, Welcome to all who are watching today. My name is Paul Tetreault. I'm the director of Ford's Theater, and you're participating in the first event of our new series called Cabinet Conversations, exploring creativity, history, and leadership. Cabinet Conversations will be scheduled on a bi-weekly basis and simulcast to audiences through digital platforms, including Facebook Live, YouTube, Twitter, and the Ford's Theater website. In the months ahead, we'll bring you conversation with scholars, artists, and other thought leaders to think aloud about the future of the arts, civics, and history. Diverse in topic, each conversation will connect the lessons of the Civil War, Lincoln's presidency, and legacy to our contemporary life. Today, we are very excited to welcome author and historian James Swanson. Now, James, of course, wrote the seminal book for Ford's Theater called Manhunt, the 12-Day Hunt for Lincoln's Killer in 2007. And he followed that up with the book for young readers called Chasing Lincoln's Killer, which was published by Scholastic. Now, I like to say that Manhunt is required reading for anyone before you attend Ford's Theater, but it is absolutely required reading for anyone who works at Ford's Theater. James, welcome today. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be with you.
Well, listen, James, you know, you and I have had these conversations over many years, and I have said that, you know, it wasn't really, I mean, I was hired in '04 at Ford's. Your book came out in '07, and it wasn't until your book, and I read Manhunt cover to cover, that I finally understood the very special place that I was working. Now, you know, the staff often gives me a list of questions and says, you know, why don't you ask James initially how he came to be intrigued with Abraham Lincoln? I, of course, know that answer because you and Abraham Lincoln share the same birthday, February 12th. So I know that your fascination with Lincoln goes way, way back. But tell us when it really started to, you know, sort of get you being the sort of Lincoln aficionado that you are.
Well, Paul, it really began on my 10th birthday. My grandmother gave me an unusual gift. Not a baseball bat, not a basketball, growing up in Chicago, not a hockey stick. She gave me a framed engraving of John Wilkes Booth's Derringer pistol that he used to assassinate Abraham Lincoln with. Kind of an unusual gift for a child. Then that engraving was framed with a clipping from the Chicago Tribune from the morning of April 15th, 1865, the morning that Lincoln died, because he died a day later after he was shot. And I hung that on my bedroom wall. And I must have read that clipping 1,000 times during my childhood. It said, "The president shot at Ford's Theater is dying. The Secretary of State stabbed. John Wilkes Booth, the actor, the killer." And that's really the gift that led to me writing Manhunt. And that's really how my interest in Lincoln became a passion. Of course, as a child, I went to some of the Lincoln sites as a boy, Springfield, his home, the Chicago Historical Society that had Lincoln relics. But my interest really took off with that gift from my grandmother when I was a 10-year-old boy.
That's fascinating. You know, the thing that's great, James, and it actually sort of makes a little sense, your book reads so, you know, quickly. I mean, people have often said to me, oh, it reads like a detective novel or it reads like a murder mystery. And, you know, the idea that you became fascinated with Lincoln as a young person actually, I think, plays into the way you write. It's so engaging and pulls people in. How did you come about that style? Or was it just something that you thought, I want to write the way I would be engaged? How did you come across that?
The way I did it, of course, you know, Abraham Lincoln is one of the most written about people in history, along with Jesus, Napoleon, other famous names. And so I decided first I had to write a book that was unlike all the other books, because otherwise why do the book? And I also wrote the book that I had always wanted to read, but no one else had written. And I wanted to take the assassination and the chase for Booth minute by minute in chronological order. I want the reader to understand and know events as they happened. In other words, if you had been alive in 1865, the night Lincoln was shot, you would have learned about the events as they unfolded over time. You wouldn't know on day 10 what happened on day 12. You wouldn't know the night Lincoln was shot what happened on the 12th day of the manhunt. It was kind of like writing a book about the Titanic. You know the Titanic is going to sink. It's going to hit the iceberg. Everybody's going to die. But I want the reader to suspend judgment and pretend that they don't know how the story ends. Of course, if you pick up Manhunt, you know it's about the death of Abraham Lincoln. You know he's shot at Ford's Theater. You know John Wilkes Booth shot him. You know he's going to die. But I want the reader to suspend doubt and imagine that it's not necessarily going to happen that way. So it's very chronological, very time driven, very moment by moment. And that's how I wanted to experience the story. And I thought readers would enjoy it that way too.
Well, James, let me pick up on that point because I do think that one of the things that's great about your book is, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. You didn't write a book like everyone else. You know, there's hundreds, thousands of books about Abraham Lincoln out there. Yours is unique. And one of the things about it is, look, if someone picks it up and sort of says, oh, April 14th, I know Lincoln was assassinated. April 15th, I know he died. I know John Wilkes Booth did it. I know it was at Ford's Theater. Okay, let's assume the whole world knows those facts. What's amazing about Manhunt is all the intricate details that you fill in throughout that. Now, when did you start doing your research, and when or at what point, what item did you see or turn to, whether it was Booth's compass or whether it was, the mask that the assassins were hung in? At what point, what triggered you? And then tell us about sort of the research process, because that's what's amazing about your book is all the detail that is in there that most people do not know about.
Well, that's the only way I can do a book. I need to go to the places and see the objects or touch the objects. I couldn't do a book just based on library research or reading things online. I need to go places and see things. And there are two relics that really probably moved me most deeply. Of course, I've looked at all the wonderful relics at Ford's Theater, the Derringer pistol, Booth's knives, his Spencer carbine, all those things. But there were two items that were very personal to me. And I've been collecting Lincoln things since I was a little boy. And so in a way, I've been researching Manhunt all my life, although it took me really 2 years to write the book once I started to write the book. Two things really made it live for me. One is a lock of Abraham Lincoln's hair. I hung that on my bedroom wall while I was writing Manhunt. It was collected from Lincoln's head the morning he died at the Peterson House by Secretary of War Stanton. And then he put it in an envelope, and with his own hand, he wrote, "For Mrs. Wells." And that was a gift from Mary Jane Wells, the wife of the Secretary of the Navy, one of Mary Lincoln's few friends in Washington. And then Mary Jane Wells framed that lock of hair with flowers that had adorned Lincoln's coffin on the day of his White House funeral on April 19th. And I can imagine being in the Peterson House that morning when Secretary of War Stanton sent everyone out of the room. He was alone with the dead president, and he reached into his pocket for a knife or scissors and cut that lock of Abraham Lincoln's hair. That made the whole thing come alive to me, and it was very sad. It was very moving and touching. The other relic that really brought me into the theater box was one of the few surviving known fragments of the actress Laura Keene's dress, stained with Abraham Lincoln's blood. She came up into the box. She cradled Lincoln's head in her lap. There was mayhem. Thousands of people were rushing out of the theater. People were threatening to burn it down. That all happened while this dress was in that box, and it cradled Abraham Lincoln's head. So those two relics, the blood relic of the dress, the relic of Lincoln's hair, really brought me into the story. It was really like a time tunnel that brought me through a portal back to 1865.
Well, those were such specific personal items. I mean, obviously, a lock of Lincoln's hair is a direct connection to Lincoln, and the Laura Keene dress that she was wearing in the box and cradling Lincoln is another direct connection. So that, those are sort of extraordinary items that just, sort of immediately connects you as an author and historian to Lincoln and the events of April 14th to April 15th, 1865. Pretty extraordinary. So what are some of the other artifacts, James? Like I always, and I think I've told you this story before, that, when I first got to Ford's Theater, I went in the museum, and this was before it was renovated. And I went in the museum and I thought, there was, it seemed like it was a mishmash of things that were down in the basement museum. And I never really focused on anything. And then after reading your book, I remember you talking about the compass. And I thought to myself, that's the compass that John Wilkes Booth owned, that he had on his person for that 12-day hunt that he was using to navigate his way to the south. Now, it crossed him up a little bit of ways, or he couldn't read it very well, but that compass was there. And it wasn't until I read it in your book that I later went back into the basement museum and thought, this is extraordinary. That here this is 150 years later, and this was on the person of John Wilkes Booth, and here we have it at Ford's Theater.
Yes, I really end the book with the compass, because that's the compass that Booth held in his hand when he and David Harold were rowing across the dark waters of the Potomac River in the middle of the night. And you're right, he went the wrong way and ended up back in Maryland, but then he ultimately got across. That's the compass that guided him south day by day, and that's the compass that he had in his pocket when he was shot by the soldiers at the Garrett Farm 12 days after he escaped from Ford's Theater. And that's the compass that soldiers took from the body of the dying John Wilkes Booth. And there it is in Ford's Theater now for everyone to see. It's one of the most intimate, immediate relics of John Wilkes Booth, because that compass represents his hope of escape, of surviving all this. And there it is at Ford's. And you mentioned the compass. It reminds me of a great day we spent at the theater several years ago when the exhibits were being renovated. All the relics were out of the case. And you and I held in our hand Booth's knives, his Spencer carbine. And it made it all so real to me to see the things right there and touch them and look at them with you.
Right. Now, James, we have a lot of people who are watching us over the internet and on Facebook Live and Twitter, and we're taking questions from folks. And someone sent us a question and said, when you think of the various sites that you can visit along Booth's 12-day escape route, and I know that you have been through the entire escape route, which one do you feel, and I'm going to say outside of Ford's Theater, but which one do you feel of those various sites along Booth's escape route are the most important and meaningful, and why?
Well, one is certainly the spot along the Potomac River that Booth got in that rowboat with David Harold and launched into the river, because then he was leaving the area of Washington. That meant that he had been hiding out for 5 days with Thomas Jones. The Union cavalry had not caught him. When Booth got in that rowboat, he had hope that he would escape. He was crossing into deep into Southern territory. Booth thought he would be safe once he crossed the river. He thought that pro-Confederate sympathizers would welcome him and take care of him. So that's a very emotional moment when Thomas Jones puts Booth into that boat. Booth uses his compass and a candle to guide himself across as David Harold rows. So it's very emotional to go to that spot on the river where Booth launched himself, he thought, to freedom and safety.
Now, what is there today, James? Is that, I have not been to that site, but is there a marker there, or is there some indicator, or just that's people that go with you have insider knowledge that that's where they are?
That's more of an insider spot. It's not. It's privately owned, that stretch of the land by the river, and we've been there, and I've stood in the spot, but it's not on the regular escape tour. If you go with the Surratt Society on some of its great escape tours, I think it stops at that place, but it's not a place one can just drive onto and visit by yourself.
But privately owned, and you've been there where the site where he launched.
Yeah,
that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Now, wasn't there also something that was there, and you'll help me recollect this, that was years after the assassination, years after Booth's death, that there was a boat or something that was found there or something. Am I not recollecting that properly?
Well, what I think you're remembering is Thomas Jones, the Confederate operative who helped Booth escape. And Booth escaped too. No one knew about his role until 1893 when he wrote a book about how he had helped John Wilkes Booth escape. And he also gave an interview to the great Civil War journalist George Alfred Townsend a few years before that. Booth became a dealer in Lincoln assassination relics. And I've had a letter from Vance where he said, you know, from no one but me can you get these great relics. Can you get photos of the execution of the conspirators? Jones had hoped to get his rowboat back, but he never did. That would have been a sensational relic. But that's the story of the rowboat.
Right. Okay. Now, James, you know, as you and I both know, there's many fact and many fictions to this story. And there's legend and there's lore and there's all sorts of things. What are some of the things that, you know, in your research or just in your, you know, you've talked about, you know, this point in our history all across the globe, and you've talked about it for many, many years. What are some of the biggest sort of fallacies that you hear out there that people talk about?
Well, here are the two biggest ones. Number one, that Secretary of War Stanton conspired in the murder of Abraham Lincoln. It all began with a book called Why Was Lincoln Murdered, published by Otto Eisenschimel in 1937. It's false. Lincoln and Stanton were close. They spent summers together on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. Lincoln once said, and I'm paraphrasing, Stanton is the rock upon which the waves of rebellion crash and are broken. Without him, I could not survive. It's false and absurd and defamatory to believe that Secretary of War Stanton, Lincoln's right-hand man, who Lincoln called my Mars, my God of War, conspired against the president. Stanton was shattered by the death of Lincoln. So that's probably the worst and biggest myth, that there was a conspiracy by Lincoln's own cabinet to kill him. Totally false. The other big myth is that Booth escaped and survived. There were two different men who claimed that they were John Wilkes Booth. One of them was mummified, and until the 1930s, his corpse was displayed at carnivals and state fairs. We know it was Booth. He was captured with David Harold, one of his accomplices. He had a tattoo on his hand that Booth had. Many people who knew him identified him at his autopsy. He was carrying a handwritten journal of sorts on his body. He was carrying other relics that were known to be Booth's. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that it was John Wilkes Booth who was killed at the Garrett Farm by the Union Cavalry Patrol. So those are the two biggest myths.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that, because James, you've got, you know, insight here. One of our listeners actually asked that very question, that, you know, tell us about the debunking of the, you know, that Booth survived and that he lived till later in life, which of course was a recent television show recently that sort of talked about Booth alive and his later life.
Yes, there have been a few. In the 1970s, there was actually a TV show about the Lincoln conspiracy, so-called, that Stanton was involved, that Booth might have survived. We want to believe these stories because they're exciting, they're tantalizing, they're dramatic, but they're not true.
Right. Now, James, you know, we have a lot of young listeners with us today. And let me ask you something. What advice would you share with amateur historians who are interested in writing a book?
A couple pieces of advice. First, I'm glad so many young people are listening in. I always like speaking to classes. And I got to give a little shout out to Mr. McIntyre's class. I know they're all watching today, so thank you, guys. I'll give two pieces of advice. To write well, you've got to read a lot and read how others have written well. So I encourage all young people to read books about history. And secondly, it's important to go to places where history happened. I certainly encourage every young person who's watching to visit Ford's Theater, go to the museum, visit the theater, go to the Peterson House. As soon as it's safe to travel again, if you can come to Washington, D.C., you've just got to go to Ford's Theater and see everything there. So it's mostly reading, it's curiosity. Become an observer. Most people don't have great situational awareness unless you're in the CIA or one of the intelligence agencies. Observe what you see. Note the details. Great history is built on details. What were people wearing? What did they dress like? Which building was near that building? What was their route that they walked from the hotel to the bar to Ford's Theater? Those little telling details really are the stuff of history, the beginnings of history. So I encourage young people who are interested in writing to read a lot, to go to the places where history happened and become enthusiastic about it. I tell young people that while I was writing Manhunt, I sat in Ford's Theater more than 100 times. I wrote part of the book sitting in Ford's Theater. There's nothing like going to the places where history happened. So that's some of the advice I give young people.
Well, I know that for a fact because I know when you were writing the book, some of the National Park Service rangers used to say, "Oh my God, here's that crazy guy again. He says he's writing this book." And I think for a while, James, they thought you were just like a crazy homeless person that needed a place to stay. And then you, of course, put out this great book. So let me ask you a question, which I think is a great advice to young people, is like read about history and understand history. So obviously, you've read probably hundreds of books on Abraham Lincoln. Aside from your own book, what is one or two books that you would highly recommend about Abraham Lincoln, either that are just brilliant or books that sort of really influenced you? What would you tell our listeners?
I'll mention a few. I'll mention the first full-length biography that I read about Abraham Lincoln. It's Benjamin Thomas's book from the 1950s about Lincoln. It still holds up well. It's not too long, and it's a great read. I recommend that. I've always loved Carl Sandburg. He's a great lyricist, a great writer. Of course, since he wrote The Prairie Years in the 1920s, The Warriors in the 1930s, there are some factual errors. There are some things that we know more about. But in terms of getting a great feeling of the era of Abraham Lincoln and that lost moment in time, Carl Sandburg is a great writer. Walt Whitman once said, "So much of the Civil War will be buried in eternal darkness forever." Sandburg helps capture the spirit of the time, as does Walt Whitman. So those are two great writers. I recommend Michael Burlingame's great 2-volume massive treatise on Abraham Lincoln. It's the best Lincoln biography ever written, the most detailed one. But for someone starting, I recommend Thomas, and I recommend 20 Days. It's a great picture book that I read as a young man by the Kunharts about Abraham Lincoln. So I would start with those. They're just great reads.
Great, terrific, thank you. Now, James, we had from one of our, I'm going to turn to some specifics now about the assassination. One of our listeners said, how close was Booth when he shot Lincoln, and what does point blank mean in this instance?
Okay. Well, Booth crept into Lincoln's theater box, which is a fairly contained space. And he approached Lincoln from behind, and Lincoln was sitting in the rocking chair. So Booth was closest to the president. Mary Lincoln was sitting to the president's right, and then more to the president's right were Clara Harris and Major Rathbone, Lincoln's guests. So the confined space of that box means that Booth had to be at least 2 feet away, but I think he was much closer. Booth was carrying a single-shot pistol. He didn't want to miss. Evidence suggests that he walked right behind the president and was inches away. You know, we didn't have CSI then the way we would today, so we'd know if there's a powder burn on the back of Lincoln's head and how close the pistol was. But I'm guessing that Booth was so close to the president, he could have almost touched him with the muzzle of the pistol. So he was probably just a few inches away. I think less than 6 inches away from the president's head. It was dark. He didn't want to miss. He had one shot. He had to get close. So I think that's how close he was.
James, we're sort of getting to a point of, sort of wrapping up a little. I got a couple more questions here for you. But one, sort of playing along with the idea of sort of myths to be debunked and things. What is one part of the story? And let's say, the story that you tell, which is the Abraham Lincoln assassination, and also the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. What part of that story do you think is underemphasized and not told enough? And what part of that story do you think is overemphasized and told too much?
Well, one part of the story that's underemphasized is one of my favorite girls in history. the daughter of Secretary of State Seward. Many people have forgotten that as Booth was assassinating Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, one of his accomplices, Lewis Powell, with David Harold helping him, entered Secretary of State Seward's house and almost stabbed him to death in his bedroom. He was essentially crippled by a carriage accident, and he couldn't move, he couldn't escape, and he was almost stabbed to death. Fanny Seward, this young woman, was brave and threw her body in front of Powell to protect her father. She searched the house for other conspirators. She was drenched with blood. So Fanny Seward is one of the great unsung heroines of that night. And I wish more attention would be paid to her. And I wish she would have been remembered. Sadly, she died as a young woman in her 20s. She would have been a great writer. She kept a journal during her time in Washington during the Civil War. And it well merits reading. And she's one of the forgotten great people of this story. So I always like to remember the brave Fanny Seward.
That's wonderful. What a great story.
And probably the most overemphasized is the alleged innocence of some of the conspirators, like Dr. Samuel Mudd and Mary Surratt. As you know, 8 of them were put on trial in July 1865. 4 of them were executed. Dr. Mudd knew who John Wilkes Booth was. They had met before on prior occasions. Mudd was helping Booth with his earlier conspiracy to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. Mudd certainly didn't know, I think, that Lincoln was going to be shot that night, but he was part of a plan to kidnap the President of the United States in the middle of a Civil War. Mudd helped Booth. He sent the soldiers in an opposite direction. He delayed telling people that Booth had been at his farm. So Dr. Mudd was very lucky to escape hanging. One more vote of guilty would have resulted in his execution, but he was spared and then released and then died years later. Mary Surratt is often portrayed as an innocent woman who knew nothing. Her son, John, was a Confederate agent and conspirator with Booth to kidnap the president. She knew these things. She knew the conspirators met at her house. If her son had been captured and not escaped, she might have survived. But Mary Surratt behaved very much in a guilty way. She knew Lewis Powell when he came to her door at night. She denied it. There's much more to the Mary Surratt story, much more to the Dr. Mudd story. And I try to cover them in my books because Dr. Mudd was not the innocent country physician who was railroaded. He knew a lot more and did a lot more. And I'm convinced that Mary Surratt knew about the plot of her son and Booth to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. And so there's much more nuance to their story than them being simply the innocent people that some people portray them as.
Right. Well, thanks, James, so much for that. Believe it or not, I'm having a little technical difficulties here at my home. My camera has gone out, but I have a feeling that you all can see me perfectly. So
I can see you.
You perfect. I like to hear that. Listen, James, there was one more question that came in, which was, whatever happened to Corbetts' rifle? Do you have any clue to that? Came through with one of our listeners.
Well, Boston Corbett, the eccentric sergeant who shot John Wilkes Booth, which caused his death several hours later, was armed with 3 weapons. He was armed with a Colt revolver. All cavalrymen carried either 36 or more likely 44 caliber Colt revolvers. They all should have carried Spencer or sharp carbines and cavalry swords, which were not useful weapons, but they would still carry them for symbolic purposes. Corbetts' revolver was a prized relic at the time. He was offered more than $1,000 for it by a relic hunter, and Corbett refused to sell it. Then one night, after I think he was sleeping, possibly drinking, it was stolen from Boston Corbett, and that revolver has never been found again. All Colt revolvers were made with serial numbers. So if we could find out the serial number of the revolver that was issued to Corbett, and then check every serial number in the world for surviving Colt revolvers from the Civil War, we might find that pistol again. I'm sure its connection to the assassination has been broken now. If someone has that pistol, they don't know they have it. And so that's one of the great treasure hunts that's still left in the story. Where is the pistol that killed John Wilkes Booth?
I love that. Well, while we're on relics, and then I know we're gonna wrap it up soon. Now, you know, people have to understand that James and I have known each other for over 15 years, and he and I could sit down and talk for hours about this stuff, and have often done that. So I want to make sure that we don't get carried away, James, as you and I can on this story. But while we're on the issue of relics, you talk about Corbett is one of those sort of the great mysteries out there and is still sort of a search. What are we're talking about sort of debunking some of the myths. What are some of the awesome relics that exist or are out there or people have claimed to that you know are totally bogus? And I know you probably have a list, but what's like one or two that just jumps out at you?
Well, there are often fake John Wilkes Booth autographs that appear. I saw one on eBay recently, allegedly a photograph autographed by John Wilkes Booth. I could tell from 10 feet away that it wasn't the autograph of John Wilkes Booth. That's certainly true. There's some various relics, like a piece of the barn that Booth was shot in, or that sort of thing. Strangely, those relics often turn out to be real. I haven't been confronted with that many fake relics. I have seen a number of fake reward posters purporting to advertise a reward for John Wilkes Booth, even the $100,000 reward. And I've also seen some other fake things purporting to have once belonged to Booth or being a cane from Booth, but there's no provenance. There's no proof that it's true. There are a lot of reproductions. I hate to say fake, but there are many facsimile reproductions of the famous Ford's Theater playbill that was created the night Lincoln was shot. There are two versions of the authentic one, and they're difficult to identify. So I would say 95% of the Ford's Theater playbills you see out there in museums or at auctions or on eBay or wherever are not authentic. But many of them were created shortly after the assassination as souvenirs. They weren't created in modern times to defraud people. They were created just to give people souvenirs. So that's probably the thing I'd be most suspicious of. If you see a Ford's Theater playbill, it's probably not real. And if you see a New York Herald newspaper reporting on the assassination, if it has a woodcut on the front page of Lincoln without a beard, it's a fake. It was made in the 1930s or 1940s. Those were probably the two most common so-called fakes I see. The playbill and a newspaper depicting a woodcut of Lincoln on the cover or on front page without a beard. There were no images of Lincoln on the front pages of the paper that reported his death.
So our lesson to all of our listeners today is if you find an artifact or you're thinking about buying a relic, you better check with the historian James L. Swanson. And the way to reach James is James L. Swanson, his Twitter feed, which I understand is very active. And, I'm sure if you sent him a photograph, something you're thinking about buying, he could give you his great knowledge of both his study and his collecting of Lincoln relics and Lincolnias that he's been on for years, right, James?
Well, I can add this, Paul. If people are descended from the Manhunters, if they had relics, artifacts, broadsides, John Wilkes Booth things, or they shouldn't ask me for advice on how to buy them. They should send them to me so I can add them to my collection.
Well, listen, this has been wonderful. As I said, James, you and I could do this once a month because we could pick a new topic every time we sit down. Clearly, James is not only, a terrific author, a great historian, he's an advisory council member of Ford's Theater. He's a friend of Ford's Theater, and he's really been a great advisor to the institution and to me personally. And for that, James, I say thank you. And thank you so much for being with us today. I want to thank James for being our inaugural guest of our cabinet conversations. When the team at Ford started thinking about doing this, I said, well, of course, there's only one person we can start this off with, and that's James Swanson. So James, thank you for being with us today. And thanks all of you for watching and listening. We'll continue to respond to your comments and questions. If we didn't get a chance to take your questions during the live session today, we encourage you to visit Fords.org for details about our next cabinet conversation. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Mr. Swanson, and good day, and we look forward to seeing you all soon, and hopefully seeing you very soon at Ford's Theater. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Paul.